I'm Ivan Oransky, and to my right, I'll introduce in a moment Alison Abbott. And you are here, if you didn't know, or if you think you're in the wrong session, sort of like if you got on the plane and they told you this is the last time you can leave to go to somewhere else. This is a session on reporting on scientific misconduct and fraud. Again, I'm Ivan Oransky. I am the Vice President of Medscape. I'm the co-founder of Retraction Watch, and I teach journalism at NYU. I'm also the president of the Association of Healthcare Journalists, so I'm really pleased to welcome you here and to talk about something that I obviously think a lot about and hope to share with you today, and again with another terrific panelist, Alison Abbott. I do want to just apologize on behalf of myself, really, for putting this together, and also for two panelists who unfortunately couldn't join us at the last minute. Illness, family illness, and personal illness kept two panelists from joining us, someone from Brazil and someone from India. Unfortunately, again, they couldn't travel to be here, and so I hope that we can do them justice and share what I've certainly learned from reading their work, which is quite terrific and which I will reference at different points. So what we're going to do today, again, is this is a bit of a how-to session. I know this is in the Beyond Cheerleading, the Beyond Cheerleading track. I think this is sort of extreme beyond cheerleading. It's one thing to sort of think about just being transparent and what have you. Here we are actually reporting on, frankly, most of the time, quite bad behavior. Some of the behavior, I don't know that it any longer shocks Alison. It sort of doesn't shock me anymore, but some of the behavior may shock some of you as you hear it. But the goal is to give you tips and tricks and very actionable, again, tools to be able to report on these issues yourself. I see many of you in the audience who have actually done this work, many of who I've spoken to, and it's a pleasure to see you. But the goal also is not just to help you report on fraud and misconduct, but to help you just think about accountability journalism, what kinds of documents to obtain, what kinds of questions to ask, how to ask them, how to protect yourself, as well as how to protect your sources, because both of you, in this case, are vulnerable, probably in different ways, but those are really important questions to ask. So first up, I'm going to ask Alison Abbott, who is a reporter at Nature and based in Berlin, who's reported on a number of these cases throughout her career, to talk a little bit about her experience and to give us, again, some tools and tricks. We really want this to be quite interactive. Again, because there are only two of us, it would feel odd if we just sort of lectured to you for 70 minutes or whatever we have. Please do raise your hands or somehow otherwise make yourselves known. The lights are a little bit bright, so don't be afraid to gesticulate a little bit more sort of wildly, just to make sure that one of us sees you. We really do want this to be a conversation, and we know that for some of you this is quite old hat, for some of you it's quite new, and so please, we encourage you to stop us, ask us for more information, make sure something's clear, or just to ask a different question. That would be wonderful, and again, we can actually be a little bit more relaxed here than if we had lots of panelists. I guess that's the only upside to that. So without any further ado, Alison. I think this will come up.
So thanks, Ivan. How do we get this going? No?
Hello. You have to put it in slideshow.
Okay, go on then.
Like that. And that's working.
Thanks. You're welcome. Thanks, everybody. Nice to be here. So, as Ivan said, we're not going to give lectures. I'm just going to give you two examples of stories that I've done that represent the whole thing quite well, because they're big stories that went on over a few years and required different types of reporting. And I think in total, I got at least 5 stories out of each one of these. And then I'm going to just present you with some take-home messages and then hope for questions. And then Ivan is going to do something similar and hope for questions. So the two stories that I'm going to briefly outline are different types of science misconduct stories. And one of them, which is this one, is about how faked data can be used by the bad guys to affect something in society. In this case, it's public health. And the second example I'm going to show you is just somebody who repeatedly carries out fraud in the lab and gets away with it, thereby contaminating the literature. So they're two quite different stories, but important in their own way. So this is a big story that came from Italy about a stem cell fraud. And you've heard these stories before. Some maverick doctors will offer you some therapy which they say will cure your incurable disease, and that they're stopped from helping you sometimes by, the FDA, EMEA, and other authorities that just stand in their way. And this is one such story, and it's particularly extraordinary. If you look on the sort of the faded background slide, this is the guy who was perpetrating it. And perhaps you might already wonder how such a guy could be so successful in his endeavors. I mean, he doesn't look the part. And when you see him on TV, he doesn't present the part either. He's quite wild. And in comparison, you have the sober scientists who are trying to say it's all nonsense. So this story rose to above our hurdle for what makes a story because of its particular impact on the government, on the judiciary, and on all the other organizations that are supposed to protect a democracy. So he started his work in Turin, and he was injecting people with Parkinson's disease with stem cells that he would take from their own blood, spin them down, do some magic tricks, and then inject them back into the same patient. And apparently this will not cause any problems because you're only giving back to people what came from their bodies, so it's safe, which of course for many reasons it is not safe. He drew the attention of the public prosecutor in Turin. The European Union laws changed, making it difficult to give therapy where you don't have the required proof of efficacy. So he moved to San Marino. He was chased from San Marino and went to Trieste. He was chased from Trieste and went to Brescia, which is where the big authorities of Italy, the Medicines Authority, went into his lab, saw the mess and the unhygienic conditions, and closed the lab. And then the remarkable thing was that this guy has a sort of Rasputin quality. He managed to get his patients to go on the street and do the sort of the passionate, the doctors, the authorities are stopping us from curing people. And this was one of the most remarkable pictures of a naked woman writing around, stamina for life, free stamina. And then it just got worse step by step. The government decided to run a clinical trial with taxpayers' money on something that everybody knew could never work and should just simply be stopped. And the scientists started to object, and then things got a level even worse, that they had a committee of scientists that provided the evidence for the government, and that their decision was overruled by a court, and therefore these guys could be treated again with this therapy. All sorts of health problems for the patients, by the way. It wasn't just in the minds that this could be dangerous, that people suffered for it. I could go on, but let me move to the next one because there's an even higher level. So this is a story that began in 2010, I think, or 2009 even, when the whole concept of faking your results with the cut and paste was very much at the beginning. And it wasn't in everybody's consciousness. And it's the story of a guy called Enrico Bucci who wanted to come back from Germany to Italy. Both stories are by coincidence Italian. And he wanted to set up a little company. And the company was to offer an image searching service. And for this, he needed to create a database of all of the images that were in the scientific literature that he had access to, the open access images. And then he had to go a step further and clean them up. And then he found out with his software that about 25% of all images in all biomedical publications had something that wasn't quite right about them, not necessarily fraudulent, but not quite right. So what he has to clear it out, but the amount of problems made him very worried. And so he decided to dig a little bit deeper and focus on the Italian groups whose name came up very high on this list. And as time went on, he decided to focus on this one guy called Fusco, and found that something like 94 of his papers were contaminated with software, with imaging problems. So what do you do in these circumstances? You find out what the method is, in your country for expressing your concern about scientific fraud. And he found that there wasn't one. So he went to the police. And then the police went and raided the lab of Fusco and impounded all their computers and notebooks, and found that, among other things, that this guy not only, he knew very well what he was doing, because he actually hired an image company to fake the images for him, so he didn't even have to do it himself. So it was quite blatant. And this story went on to the different levels, so what happens now, what happens next. I mean, at this point, you have to find, the university has to do something. And it did something. It created, just made up the rules and created an investigation committee, which was chaired by one of Fusco's co-authors. So you see, and then it goes even further, and then it gets a little bit more murky. The police presented all this evidence, but they couldn't get enough for a prosecution, because you need to say what the crime is. And the actual crime was a little bit difficult to construct. It's fraudulent, it's defrauding the public coffers, of course, but it's tricky, and it's always tricky in these fraud stories. So they went to the press in Naples, which is where this was occurring. And the press ran this story in a way that I couldn't, because, we have what we call the fact check Stasi, but we do love them, they protect us. And they keep us on the right track to make sure that we have all our documentations to protect ourselves in court if it comes to that. But anyway, so it was exposed in this way, and the rector of Naples, there was a new rector, and things started to look hopeful, because he said, this behavior is not tolerable, we're going to create a new set of rules for the university and a new investigation committee that will be, better organized, more independent. At the time, there was a dean in the university who would never speak to me, because he was always protecting Fusco. And then at one point, he decided that he would speak to me. And he spoke to me quite frankly, this is terrible, this has to come to an end. And then he became head of the new committee, which was, what are the consequences of this, which is no longer to be denied. And of course, we weren't really tricked, but we were caught, because this guy, he gave out that he was now a goodie. He'd realized that this behavior is intolerable. But in fact, it was all a pretense, because now he was in this position on the committee. He could organize that nothing would happen to Fusco, and that's what happened. So these are the stories, and at each stage, I was able to get a story out of it that was more outrageous than the previous one. And in fact, my stories turned out to be quite influential. Influential to a certain point. In the stamina story, I was able to find that the basis on which these guys were declaring their therapy was a patent which they'd applied for, not a patent that they'd received, but applied for. And I got the images in the patent to be checked, and found that they were the same reproduced images from a Ukrainian group. And through various searches, I actually found the Ukrainian group and managed to luckily get the researcher on the phone and tell her, this is your picture and it's been used in this way. Turns out that she had been working with the fraudulent guy, Vanoni, and was very, very angry. So she went public. She allowed me to use her name and to say that this is a complete deception. The figure that she had published was for something quite different anyway. And this was used in the government discussions to stop the treatment. But as I say, you know, people would always come through the back door and get it going again. So I could name you quite a few stories that follow the same pattern. And what I've learned about how to do these cases is, and this, I mean, they're all important, but this one I think is never obvious to your editor. I mean, of course, you have to tell the editor what you're doing. I mean, I'm not hiding anything from the editor, but the editor always wants you to, you know, like, well, go and ask him, and then we can run this story. And this is not the way to do it. First of all, if you've got a big, complex story, if it gets out among the baddies that they're being chased, they have huge networks who will come around in some direction and change the things. So the documents that you think that are going to work no longer work. So how I always work is I gather as much data as I can before I go for my challenge. Because when you have a bad guy story, you go to the bad guy and say, there's all these allegations against you, what is your comment? This has to be done like a couple of days before you publish, otherwise all the facts are going to change. And the second thing is, you know, you have to understand the institutions you're dealing with. So for the Naples story, for example, you have to understand the relationships between the deans and the PIs in the university to see what's plausible, whether what they're saying is actually going to be plausible. And something that is obvious to me, but I've come across people journalists who've fallen down over this. Only ask inflammatory questions if you need the answers and you're going to use it. And I remember one story, it wasn't for a high-profile journal or anything, but a journalist who was chasing somebody went to Harvard University personnel department and demanded as her right the salary, to know the salary of a particular person in the institution. I mean, Harvard would never tell you this. So, you know, why do it? So what happened, of course, is the personnel department contacted this particular guy and said, there's, you know, somebody trying to get your salary, what's going on? And he was furious and went public, and, you know, this story was then crushed. If you need the information, you have to ask all the inflammatory questions that you can. But, you know, beware of the repercussions. I mean, however you operate, nothing must let you stop your story. And then, of course, there's, you have to understand the motivation, because when you start, you have to ask yourself, why is he doing this? Why is she doing this? I mean, for the Vanoni case, it's obvious. He's doing it for the money and the glory, you know, the Jesus complex. But other cases, the motivation won't be simple because you won't have all the information that helps you understand this. But it's very important. And the other thing is to work cooperatively with the editor and the lawyer, because the buck stops with the lawyer, particularly under British law, which is the toughest in the world, I think. I think Ivan will tell you something about other countries. But you're not going to get past the lawyer, so you have to cooperate from the beginning with the lawyer and with the editor, because the editor needs to be patient, and you need to be patient with the editor. These things are difficult. And the other thing is, of course, remember that you're not the story. You are not the hero. You are nothing in this story. You're just bringing it up, and you shouldn't really appear it, in my opinion. Oh, yes, so I put this in at the end because when you're doing these stories, I think it's very, very helpful to get your interviews if people know you as a straight scientific journalist as well. And so, you know, if you have a portfolio that includes just sort of stories about the wonder of science that are, you know, very well researched and very well received, this will actually help you in forward stories because people will trust you, and a lot is based on trust. And then just running through the sources of stories, just in case it prompts any questions, I won't labor that. But where do I get my stories from? Retraction Watch, of course, various blogs. But mostly from tip-offs, because the longer you're in the business, the more often people come to you and tell you their problems. And then you read things that other magazines or outlets have exposed, maybe just in one country or whatever, and you can find some way to follow up on somebody else's exclusive. It's always best to have your own, but you can follow up on somebody else's exclusive with a different angle on the story. And then sometimes I get story ideas from just reading something that's nothing to do with fraud, and something just strikes you as being basically wrong. And you know, something is implausible in the story, and you can follow it from there. And then sometimes you get these fraud stories from just asking big picture questions about how the world works. And once you've asked, you know, the big obvious question, you can sometimes home in on something that doesn't make sense and follow it from there. And so that's the end of my little presentation, Ivan.
Thank you. I think I'm going to just present a few stories similar to what Alison was talking about and give my own suggestions, and then we'll take questions at the end. So let me just do this. Okay. All right. I've sort of told you all of that, so I'll just move right along. I'm going to go through, similar to what Alison did, as I said, 3 different stories very quickly, just to give you a sense of the kinds of, you know, tales and stories you might find. And I'm going to try, as I do that, to show you where they came from, and to give you a sense of how you might find your own. I think that's the whole point here. At the same time that we all find stories from one another, we also, of course, all compete. But I would argue, and maybe I'm just being a little bit too optimistic or maybe too generous, I don't know, that there are so many of these stories around that if each of us who are interested in this, if each of you in this room went out and found a different story, we would still have many more. So again, competition is sort of actually, I think, useful often. It certainly gets me up in the morning, among other things. But it is also something that I think we need to be realistic. So here's one, and actually you'll see I actually added a slide just this morning because there's been a big development in this case. But this is David Latchman. He still is a geneticist at University College London. Quite prominent, actually, geneticist. A lot of funding, public funding, and otherwise. So this is a story from Retraction Watch, and a post from Retraction Watch in January 2015 that gives you a sense of how we get started, right? And you know, the name on the door is Retraction Watch, so we get started generally with retractions. That's changed over time. Happy to talk about that. But so there's a retraction and 2 corrections. The retraction notices were not particularly clear. We didn't really know what had happened, which is often the case, as I'll discuss. And so, okay, we did that. We did a few other stories. I'm not going to include every single one of them, but here's a story from the Telegraph in May 2018, where they're picking up, not just on our coverage, by this time others had covered this story as well, but this became a big story for them. And then actually just last night, or yesterday afternoon in the US, and The Guardian had a story also based on some documents. And again, I'm going to talk a bit about what sorts of documents to request with public information laws and what have you. Just yesterday, Peter Aldis and Ian Sample, who's at the Guardian, separate stories, reported on 3 different investigations that had happened that they were able to obtain the records of, the reports of, because of public records laws in the UK, which is an active sort of discussion, I know, that's happening there. But this just gives you a sense that how stories started and how it can become much bigger. Latchman, like Fusco and like many others, doesn't seem to have suffered any real repercussions from what's happened, and it's unclear. Even the reports, the most damning reports, don't say that he committed the misconduct, and I think that's something else to always take a look at. Is what it's in the U.S. This goes back to, I forget actually which presidency, and one of my colleagues may remind me as I'm standing here. But what did he know, and when did he know it? And that's kind of a lot of what these investigations turn on. I'll give you another example. Also, sorry, from the UK. I guess you really talked about Italy, so I'll just talk about the UK today. I do have other cases, don't worry. This was Retraction Watch, and I'll tell you a little bit about the story in a few minutes. Adam Marcus and I established a launched Retraction Watch in August 2010. So this is one of our earliest stories. We were still quite, excited, and well, we're still very excited, but we were quite new and green at that time. And so this was a retraction notice that ran in Nature. And I should just specify, anytime I'm talking about Nature, the news side of Nature and the manuscript side, the peer review side, are quite separate, as they are at Science and a lot of other publications. But this was a paper that had been published in 2004, and in November 2010 it was retracted. It was in Nature. And there was a reference here to supplementary information, and actually when you clicked on supplementary information, nothing happened. You got an error. I don't remember what kind of error, but you got an error of some kind. And it turned out that the university was going to publish the investigation report, and it was supposed to go out, with the issue of Nature. It didn't, which often actually happens. But it was published, or actually they sent it to us, and then we published it a few months later. This was a case of someone, he was a postdoc at the time, who he actually not only had committed misconduct, but, and this is where I don't sort of know Dante well enough, but metaphorically anyway, if there are a number of circles of hell, then I think the lower circles of hell, is it lower? It would be lower, the worse? I don't know either. But the worst fates should meet those who actually sabotage others' work, which is what he managed to do. So he was not content to just make things up himself. He actually decided the only way to get ahead would be to make sure that no one else in his lab actually had any successful results. So he sabotaged theirs as well. But what was particularly interesting about this story, and I think this gets to a lot of what Alison was talking about, you keep building stories, you get 4 or 5 out of a single case. In our case, we're a blog, so we might get a dozen out of a single case, was that a few months later, I got an email, and this is one of those emails that I'm sure you've received similar emails. I love these emails. It says, it's an anonymous email, and it says, I believe you will be very interested in the attached PDFs. And I guess I should be more cautious and make sure that there isn't some spyware. Google or Gmail checked it for me, I guess. And so I opened the PDFs, and the PDFs were actually 2 letters from when this particular researcher, Jatinder Ahluwalia, had been at Cambridge University, also, of course, in the UK. It turns out that he had been dismissed from Cambridge, his PhD program, his graduate program at Cambridge, years before even he went and got a different PhD. People still don't talk to each other. Universities still are very nervous about ever disclosing anything that happened before. And so it turned out that no one knew about this. And so I looked at these letters, and it was very clear. I mean, they were actually wonderful letters. I don't see letters like this too often that actually describe exactly what happened. And he had done exactly the same thing, but just at a different university, a more highly ranked university as well. And so I read these letters, and of course, the first thing I did, other than calling Adam and saying, I think we have a really good story here, the second thing I did was to call the person, and this is maybe a little bit of a tip that I'm going to insert into this story. I called the person whose signature was on those letters. Actually, his name is Martin Brand. He's quite a serious, quite a well-known researcher. He's now out in California. He used to be at Cambridge. And I said, are these letters legitimate? Because I don't want to, go with them if someone is actually committing fakery and making up the letters, which has happened. And I contacted Brand, and he wrote back right away and said, actually, yes, that is my signature. Those are real. He said, I never could have sent these to you, but I'm glad someone else did. And so we, of course, ran the story. And that story continued to, there were all sorts of fun little bits. And again, since we're a blog, our threshold, our bar for a post, although it's changed now, is a bit lower. I mean, it's just different. We can have little smaller stories. So one of the fun stories in this one was that this researcher, before he was eventually fired from the position he was in at this time, went to University of East London, and he hooked up with a psychologist who was studying plagiarism. So the only misconduct he had not yet committed, as best we could tell, still he may have, was plagiarism. So it was almost like, well, I've tried all the others and I've been caught, but let me see how you do plagiarism. It was fascinating. It was what in poker, someone has sort of a tell, like it was remarkable. Okay, so now I've left the UK. I'll go to a former colony, my own country. And tell you a little bit about a story that we have been actually reporting on for years now. Duke University, as some of you may know, obviously quite a prominent, well-regarded institution in the U.S., has had a particular run of misconduct cases, and I would stress that every university has had them. You just don't always hear about them. Duke, I would argue, has handled these quite badly, and it's not just me saying that. The National Institutes of Health has actually said the same thing. They've sanctioned Duke by making all of the researchers go through much more checks and balances and processes before getting grant renewals, which is a pretty serious thing for NIH to do, even though it sounds very sort of bureaucratic. This is a story that Alison McCook, who a former writer for us, a reporter and editor for us, wrote. We have a partnership with Science Magazine, and that's where this ran. This ran in August 2016 when someone filed a lawsuit. A whistleblower filed a lawsuit against Duke, really on behalf of the U.S. government. I won't get into the details of how these cases work. I'd be happy to answer questions about them. But it's a law that's unique to the U.S. It's called many things. One of them is, it's a Whistleblower Act, but it's the False Claims Act or the Lincoln Law. And this actually allows whistleblowers to collect a pretty significant amount if they win the case, which is a very difficult thing to do. It's not a black and white sort of slam dunk, as they would say on the Duke basketball team, for those of you who know that reference. But it turns out that just a couple months ago, and I'm now at Medscape, although I obviously still run Retraction Watch as well. Some of our content runs there as well. So this researcher, he was a lab tech named Joseph Thomas. By the way, his attorney in this case, one of the main attorneys is someone named John Thomas, who just happens to be his brother. So it'll be a very lovely holiday family. They told me, I saw them, I actually met Joe for the first time, but I sort of interviewed him, whatever. I met him for the first time in Hong Kong at the World Conference of Research Integrity last month. And I said, can you tell me who this Rose Thomas is who keeps tweeting, she keeps retweeting everything that I ever post. I mean, it could be about this case, it could also be about my dog, and she seems to retweet everything. Oh yeah, that's Mom. She's one of your biggest fans. I said, oh, that's great. I'll maybe visit her someday. So anyway, this is a family affair. It's actually a fascinating story on many levels. But Joe Thomas, who you're looking at here, actually collected 30% of this case. So they say that crime pays, but maybe whistleblowing can pay as well, although obviously, again, it's a rare case. But I just to very quickly sort of tell you the genesis of this story, it turns out, so the sort of main researcher in the story, although she was not the PI, who started running up the retractions, and I'll tell you a bit more about rates of retractions, what have you. Her name was Erin Potts-Cant. It still is Erin Potts-Cant. She now has 17 retractions. And so all the way along, and again, in terms of thinking about how to think about these stories and how to develop them, we had these retractions happening, and she even at one point got onto what we call our leaderboard of people with the most retractions. Very distinguished company there. Fusco I think Fusco's way at the bottom. He actually doesn't do that well. I'm sure he's very upset about that. So we didn't know, though, that there was any larger story here. We figured there might be, and I got these little wisps of information. It wasn't until I got a tip to search something, and those of you in the US, this will be more useful, but to search something called PACER, which is US federal court. So each district courts are federal courts in the US. That's how they're called. And all of their, not all the filings, because some of them are under seal and some of them are just redacted or what have you, are available online. You just go to PACER, and there's a small fee, although there's a lawsuit about that now, and whether that'll continue, we'll see. But all of these, the case was unsealed, and somehow I got a call the very next day that said, you know how you sometimes look at PACER and see if there are any universities being sued for various things? You might want to do that. And I said, can you give me a hint? There's a lot of different district courts and what have you. He said, well, maybe it's a four-letter university you've been writing about without knowing that there's this case, and there it is. There it was Duke. So briefly, and I think I'm going to go quickly through all of this because I think it's intentionally, I think, repeating or amplifying what Alison has said, but just to sort of run through it again. What makes a story for us at Retraction Watch, and everyone should have their own bar and should have their own threshold and their own audience, et cetera, are these questions. And again, I won't read them to you, you can read them there. But at this point, I will say that this has changed dramatically over time. In 2010, the fact that there was a retraction seemed like news. At least it did to us, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we launched in a minute. But it's no longer news that there's a retraction. In fact, I'll tell you just how non-newsworthy that is, given the numbers in a minute. But so nowadays it has to have something much grander than that. Maybe it's a particularly bad story, maybe it's a particularly prominent researcher to really make, even for us. And so certainly for a publication like Nature or for BuzzFeed that's reporting on these cases now, you have to have an even higher bar, and I think that's appropriate, but you want to get started somewhere. Alison sort of described a bit about how to get stories, and you'll see a lot of familiar sort of suggestions here. I guess I'm, of course, always flattered to know that reporters are reading Retraction Watch. We know that because of who signed up for our emails and where traffic comes from also, but of course, we don't source ourselves. That would be odd, although when we take stories to bigger places, I guess we do. Keep track of retractions. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Any of you know PubPeer? Anyone ever heard of PubPeer? Handful, okay, more than a handful. So keep an eye on PubPeer. PubPeer is, and I'm happy to answer questions about this, but I'll just say briefly, pubpeer.com. It's a site, and full disclosure, I'm now actually on their, it's a nonprofit, so I'm on their board, just full disclosure, unpaid position, as is Retraction Watch. But it's where anyone can leave a comment about, anonymously if need be, and most of them are left anonymously, about something they find in the literature. Now, most of these, the vast majority of these comments are critical. It's very rare to go to PubPeer and find something. This is a wonderful study. I mean, there are other outlets for that, and frankly, that's why we're beyond cheerleading in this track, right? There's other places to do that. But do keep an eye on it. Just because it's on PubPeer doesn't make it a story, and I really should stress that. It doesn't even mean that it's necessarily true, although it is vetted and there is moderation. But if there's a gathering of things, and what I find it particularly useful for is when there is a retraction and the retraction notice is unclear, which is often the case, I can go back and look at PubPeer and see, oh, that at least gives me an idea of what to ask if it's not sort of obvious. Tips, again, I described a couple there, and Alison described some. I'll talk a little bit about that. One thing I would actually, sort of suggest or ask you to consider is report on the process. We actually heard this yesterday. I didn't know that they were going to talk about this, and I think it's a nice, again, maybe redundancy or amplification. Report on the process of how this works. So yesterday we heard more about, in the opening session, report on the process of science as opposed to just this happened and here's a new study and single study problems and all of that stuff. But report on the process of science. And one of the issues, again, with the Duke story is not so much that the misconduct happened, although the misconduct's pretty grand. It's how they dealt with it, and the fact that they kept denying it, the fact that they kept trying to claim that nothing was happening, and really went after in court anyway, went after the whistleblower and his attorney. That to me is the fascinating part, in addition to the human behavior, which is, of course, also really interesting. You heard about lawyers of one stripe, sort of the ones who are helping you, and we work with them too, mostly pro bono. But lawyers are really good sources for these stories. Now, I know that every country is different. In fact, in the U.S., different states have different laws, so I'm appreciate that. However, more and more of these cases are ending up in court one way or another. So again, there's whistleblowers who actually can bring cases, at least in the States. But there's also employment law. Like, we find a lot of really good material in, researchers who are dismissed or forced to resign, or whatever the terminology is. They then sue for their jobs back. A dear friend, I believe he's a dear friend, at least collaborator of Professor Fusco, Carlo Croce, who's at Ohio State University. That's been a long ongoing saga of his retractions and corrections. He sues everyone, actually. He's suing the New York Times. He's suing one of the people who criticized him. He's now suing OSU, Ohio State University, because they removed him as chair of a department that they claimed he was never chair of. It's fascinating. I can go and for days about cases like this. But the point is that in doing so, and I often wonder whether people who are filing lawsuits really have the best legal advice, because often that's what allows me to learn far more than I could have learned if that person hadn't sued. Because they'll put in documents that the university didn't want to give me, or that they think sort of exonerate them, which nobody ever gets really exonerated. And so it's fascinating. I find investigation reports buried in court documents. There was a researcher who was fired a number of years ago now from Mount Sinai, the medical school in New York, and he years later actually shot. It was a shotgun, and the dean he had some effects, obviously, but he's fine. But he actually was so angry that he went and shot the dean who had fired him. And then when I went back and looked at these lawsuits he had filed, that's where I actually learned a lot about the case. Obviously, by then, there was the bigger fish to fry, as they say. There was a criminal case. Shooting someone is, I think, still worse than scientific misconduct, although I guess, in the States, I can't tell. Sorry, that's quite dark. I retract that. So again, develop sources and know what their agendas are. Don't be naive about it. Someone calling you to give you a story, they may like you, they may think you're wonderful, and they may think that truth should win. They also probably have an agenda, and be aware of that. And I mentioned already court documents, but I'll also talk about public records requests actually in a bit. But if you're in a country that has any kind of good public records law, please do make use of it and get some advice from people who know how to use those. Different states in the U.S. even have very different. Ohio, for example, although politically it does various things in our elections, it seems, actually has really excellent public records laws, from my point of view, which is to say that you can request a lot and they have to give you a lot. Other states, not so much. So again, I'll just back up here a little bit and tell you about why we launched Retraction Watch. I'll put another story in there. This is probably not, you can't even read it anyway. And, those of you in the U.S. will know that's President Truman holding up a Chicago newspaper when all the Chicago newspapers printed false information. Not false. It was false. They didn't know it was false. They thought that Dewey, his opponent in the presidential race, had won because they had to send all the papers to the printer before the polls closed, and so it looked as though Dewey was winning. Of course, that's never happened since, where we thought one person was winning and then the other person, no. But anyway, so it's sort of a massive retraction, right? So people, all these newspapers had to retract the paper. And it's kind of a fun little story, but it's kind of like our little, okay, this will signal something to you. Adam Marcus, who I mentioned, was my co-founder, still is my co-founder at Retraction Watch. And in many ways, to me, he sort of credits me with the idea for doing the blog. I credit him with the idea for actually covering these things at all and thinking about them, which I think is much more important. I'm kind of a technocrat. He actually has the brain. Adam had been reporting on a case of someone named Scott Rubin, and some of you may recall there's a drug called Celebrex. The generic name is celecoxib. It's sort of a cousin drug of Vioxx, rofecoxib, and these were supposed to be, 10 years ago now, these were supposed to be sort of better painkillers. And that has nothing to do actually with opioids. That was happening also, but this is separate. They were supposed to be safer than ibuprofen, some of the what we call NSAIDs. It turns out they weren't, but Scott Rubin was working on this. He was an anesthesiology researcher who was looking at pain control. And so he would, he had all these studies, and they were pretty well cited, and he was highly thought of and going around in meetings and talking about his research. But there was just, one little problem, and you can see in retrospect how, people could have overlooked this minor, really tiny problem. I'm embarrassed to even say what it was, which is that it turned out he was making up all the patients in all of his trials, right? So, again, it's really subtle. It's sort of like one of those things, how could a peer reviewer, how would you notice that? The fact that there weren't actually any ARB forms and there weren't actually any patients involved. No one was harmed in the making of that study because there wasn't anyone in that study. But so Scott Rubin eventually went to prison, actually, for this, which is a rare thing, but does happen. And Adam had been all over this story because he was the editor at the time of Anesthesiology News. So in addition to Retraction Watch and follow trade publications, because Adam, again, knew all the editors who were involved in all this. Rubin ended up having 25 retractions, again, went to prison. And so Adam and I would talk about these things, kind of like you email each other and you call each other up and, wow, this is another interesting story, and other stories like this. And finally one day I said, let's write a blog. Because again, and this I think speaks very directly to what we're talking about today, these are stories that are hidden in plain sight, right? There are retractions. And in fact, retraction notices, on average, not all of them, have improved. But one of the other reasons that we thought this was important is that a lot of them said very little or nothing, right? And so as journalists, we should, and scientists, I think, should also be concerned about this. But as journalists, we should be concerned about that. There's a real transparency problem. But it also, anytime anybody tries to hide something, I don't know about you, Alison, but I sort of assume there's a story there, and I'm actually right most of the time. So that was a big problem too, and so that's why we launched it. What we didn't know, though, was that we thought, and Adam was quoted early on saying this, that there were maybe a few dozen retractions a month. A few dozen retractions a year, and that if we posted, once or twice, and he was actually quoted saying, our mothers would read it, and now, of course, we have John Thomas's mother reading it too, which is great, and that would be fun and great. Maybe we'd break a story here and there, and isn't that neat? Of course, we were totally wrong about those numbers. We're wrong about things all the time. The nice thing about blogging is we can sort of let people know we're wrong and move on. We actually retracted a post not too long ago, about a month ago, just if you are interested. But what that came to mean in terms of our practice was that we realized we were not keeping up with retractions, and that in fact we needed a database of retractions. So thanks to some very generous funding over the years from places like MacArthur Foundation and Helmsley Trust and Arnold Foundation, we were able to create a database of retractions. Now, as you can see, and you can go there, retractiondatabase.org. It's live. You can go start searching now and not listen to me for the rest of the time. That's fine. And as you can see, we're journalists. We're not developers or certainly not designers. This is, I think someone, and then they meant well, of course, but maybe not. They said 1998 called and they want their database back. And I take that on board. That's fine. However, I will challenge you to find a better source of retractions. I know you won't because there isn't any. And so we are close to, I think as of yesterday, there were 19,500 retractions. They're just shy, we're getting close to 20,000 retractions. They're actually about 1,400 a year. I'll show you those data in a second. But you can search for your own country. You can search for a university that you like or dislike. You can search for an author. You can search for Professor Fusco if you'd like. And you will find retractions if they have them. And we also include the reason for retraction. So this is a great source of stories. And that's one of the reasons we created it. I mean, we created it mostly, I mean, if I had to say one reason we created it was so that people would hopefully maybe not stop citing retracted papers, which happens an awful lot, but at least know that they were citing a retracted paper because they could run it through the database. We just partnered with something called Zotero. Some of you may know Zotero. It's a free open source sort of bibliographic software, but it's really a reference and research tool. And so they now alert you, if you have your database with Zotero, They now alert you whenever there's one of the papers in your database has been retracted. We're delighted. They're helping support our work, of course, but we're also actually making the database useful to people who are, who need it at that minute. And you don't even have to do anything. It's a passive alert. It's like a little alarm going off, and they'll tell you why. So that's. But just to give you a sense of. Retractions by the numbers a little bit. I mentioned they're about 1,400 a year now. This gives you a sense of the growth. I won't belabor this point, but clearly there's been a growth in retractions since 2000, or obviously earlier than that, because before 1970 there really weren't any. It just wasn't something journals did. But I always put this as a percentage of papers so that you understand that, yes, the retraction rate has grown quite considerably and arguably 20-fold. Over time. Well, the actual number of retractions has grown 40-fold, but the rate of retraction is still it's still growing. Well, it may not be growing anymore, but it grew about 20-fold over time. And you can look at our, in October, Science published a 6-page feature piece that was an analysis of our database. That's when we actually launched it. And there's some other sidebars in there, and you can take a look at that, of course, and it's open access. The reason there's a blip and an asterisk in 2010 is that one publisher retracted over the course of 3 years 7,400 papers, all basically over that period of time. IEEE, which does sort of computer science and engineering and things like that. We're still not quite sure why, and the vast majority of them are from China, it turns out. So that kind of skews the numbers, both in terms of the actual numbers and in terms of, percentages from countries and things. So I'm always very careful to let people know about that, but that's what that means. I mentioned, so I'm just going to go through very quickly now, sort of expanding on some of my tips there to give you a sense of of the kinds of people I'm talking about and the stories I'm talking about. I guess, do keep an eye on PubPeer. Here's a story actually by one of our, unfortunately, and I was glad to be able to include this because he couldn't join us, but Prasad Ravanandrath, which I'm probably mispronouncing with apologies, but Prasad has been covering misconduct and fraud, so I am so delighted when he was able to be on the panel. But and he's been covering one particular story, and this is all about PubPeer, and he's been sort of on top of this, and I think it's really interesting and important to look at that way. There's a whole growing, it's still fairly small, but there's a growing sort of collection of people who I refer to as the sleuths. And these are people who somehow got the bug that there's something wrong in the literature, and maybe it's in their field, maybe it's in other fields, and they've just got some, I think, I sort of talk about them sometimes as the, I don't know, one of the superheroes, the collections of superheroes, pick your poison, whichever one it is, but they each have a unique skill, right? And they each, so on your top left, that's Nick Brown on your left and James Heathers on your right. It's a cartoon. Any of you who know the film Goodfellas, it's a mafia movie that's sort of a little homage to them, to that movie. But and you may know James from, he's a postdoc right now, but he has a Twitter feed called Just Says in Mice, right? You may have seen this, where it's all sort of about single studies that purport to be about human treatments or something, and they're actually about mice. It's brilliant, and it's sort of rocketed to the charts, top of the charts on Twitter. He's having quite a time with it. But he and Nick really, they analyze statistics and they find anomalies, and they were 2 of the 4 who were responsible for looking at the Brian Wansing case, which I won't get into, but again, just an example of a pretty well-known case, I think, at this point, that others covered. We covered, of course, but others covered, I think, better or more than we did. And Elizabeth Bick, who is, she trained as a microbiologist, and she has just these amazing, what I refer to as eagle eyes, where she can see image manipulation. Why does that image look the same as that image? There's supposed to be 2 different experiments. That image looks, like someone just turned that one 90 degrees. That shouldn't be. And she's just been this sort of quiet, and now she's sort of coming out a little bit in terms of, her identity and talking about her work. And she's actually taking a year and doing nothing but this work after leaving a biotech. But really amazing stuff. We've profiled both of them, all of them. We've profiled others as well. There's a whole collection of those on our site. These are the people who are really doing the work. And so sometimes profiling them or looking at the cases that they may bring you or that you may read about on their blogs, those can be really good sources of stories. And, although a lot of journal editors don't like to admit this, their accuracy is frighteningly high. And I think that it behooves all of us to pay attention to what they're doing. And just in terms of anonymous tips, briefly, these are the questions that I ask and think about. I actually don't differentiate, and others may differ on this, but I don't differentiate anonymous tips from those where they're willing to use their names. All I really care about is whether or not it's verifiable, whether or not it's likely to be true. And again, I don't think that anonymous tipsters have any less of a track record or any poorer of a track record than those who use their names. I'd again be happy. I don't have data on that. I don't claim to, but my experience is that there are really good reasons why people need to remain anonymous sometimes. The hierarchy of science, the sort of power differentials are quite real. And frankly, I'm sorry to have to say this, and I know you all know this, but the retribution and the vengeance can be quite severe. And I think that we need to think about that. And so these are just the questions I ask about that. I do think, though, that you have to really work hard to protect your sources. I mentioned that there's so many stories out there. We could all do a different story next week and still have tons to do. I probably not turn down, but sort of end up not pursuing like at least 90% of what people send me. And sometimes it's because it's not there, but a lot of the time it probably is there. But I have frank conversations with people who bring me stories, and I say, I would love to tell this story. It seems really strong, but here's what has happened in cases like this to the people who brought me those stories. And I said, and sometimes they understand that already. Sometimes they're out of science and it doesn't really apply to them. Sometimes they already have lawyers and it doesn't apply to them. All fine. But I want them to know that, because at the end of the day, and maybe others may say, well, you really have to do journalism first. You do, but I think you really have to take into account what might happen to these people and understand that. And do whatever you can to use secure messaging. I know that tends to focus on government reporting a lot and on other kinds of whistleblowing, but it can apply just as well to scientific reporting, I believe. I mentioned reporting on the process. This is a story that we did for Nature not quite 5 years ago now. This was a case, and I won't sort of belabor. You can read this story; it's online, open access. Also, this is where people were actually managing to do their own peer review. They were peer reviewing their own papers, which is a great thing for if you want to, going back to I feel like I'm talking about my mom a lot. Maybe I should call her. The only person who might do a nicer peer review on a paper if I ever wrote one would be my mother. Although I'm actually not sure. If I don't call her, she might not do that. But report on the process. Like, that was a fascinating story. There have now been 650 retractions, more than that actually, for fake peer review. People gaming the system that way. To me, that's kind of remarkable. But it became a fascinating story. There's another story that Alison did. This was based on public records requests. We did this story for Undark. What we were able to show, and again, I'm telling a very, very simplistic sort of description of it. You can read it yourselves. What we managed to show was that one university was investigating a particular researcher, the work of a particular researcher, actually two researchers. And in the midst of this, that researcher knew he was being investigated, was applying for a job, and actually was about to be offered a job at another university. And we actually have documents, we have emails where it says, one person saying, don't you think we should say something to this? We're going to be asked for a reference. Don't you think we should say something to the university? Like, we have really serious doubts about the work. And of course, there ended up being a U.S. government finding in this case. So there really were some serious issues. And one of the lawyers actually wrote back and said, no, don't do that. Well, gold for us, because that's proof of what we know happens without us actually being able to prove it sometimes. But again, we reported on the process. The actual fraud there was less interesting than the fact that universities were just, basically, and they weren't sort of thinking about the golden rule, right? So wouldn't you as a university want to know if someone who was applying for a job had issues? Apparently that was less important to them than not being sued, which it is what it is. And I want to give credit where credit's due here. I want to do a couple things with this slide, but one is to say, ask for the right documents. On the top left is a wonderful story, and she's reported several stories, really great, from this, from ProPublica, Jody Cohen in Illinois. Jody knew what documents to ask for. We'd actually been reporting on this story and got somewhere with it. I was pretty proud of our coverage, but we're very frustrated because the state of Illinois wouldn't give us a particular report, which they still haven't given us. But she actually figured out what to ask for that would be even more damning than that. and it was able to really break this story open. So knowing to ask the right documents, and obviously that's dependent on the particular case. And then Stephanie Lee has done amazing work on a number of cases, particularly Brian Wansink, who I mentioned. He's just actually, I guess, as of I guess Friday was his last day at Cornell. He resigned in the wake of all these questions, investigations with a misconduct finding. But she actually, you can't in the States, and I'll get into the weeds for 30 seconds, please forgive me. In the US, you can't actually file a public records request. I mean, you can file it, you'll get denied, with a private university, right? So the US has a lot of private universities, which I know is a strange thing to most of you. But if I file a public records request to a private university, they don't have to give me anything, and they don't. However, public universities do, so the state universities. So what she was able to do, even though Cornell, the part of it he was working in was private, she sent out a public records request, submitted a public records request to all of his collaborators. So she got all of the emails that Wansink had sent them. It's actually pretty clever, and really paid off in some terrific work. Again, I won't belabor this because it's just kind of what I was talking about. But these are the kinds of things that we request. And one of the things, and I'll pick one, which is correspondence between universities and journals. We didn't think to do this, but it showed up in a response once, and we thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. Kind of like, you're fishing and you're fishing for something, and then the big fish actually shows up without, I guess that's probably a problem. Now I'm thinking about it, but anyway, in reporting, it's a pretty good thing. And so, those are actually pretty useful, because what we were able to show is that journals were taking years sometimes to retract papers that universities had requested. We just can't understand why that is. I mean, like, why? You're safe at that point. Why not just do it? Again, this is just how to protect yourself, and I think you heard from Alison about lawyers. And the only thing I'll just mention here is do learn defamation laws. Alison mentioned sort of the UK being quite tough. I would argue that Germany, although the libel and defamation laws per se are probably not any tougher than anywhere else, their privacy laws are very difficult. And so those sometimes substitute. So know what you're doing and know what kinds of jurisdictions your subject that you're writing about might file a case, because I actually do like the U.S. libel laws. I mean, I'd love them to even be better, but I'm pretty secure there. But someone could sue me somewhere else, and I like to travel. I don't want to be sued somewhere else that I can't ever travel again, which has never happened, but it might. Anyway, that's the end. I've gone sort of over. But I think now we'd like to take some questions. I don't think we have mics here, so we'll just sort of try and find you and call on you. I see one back here. So if you could just project, and I'll try and repeat the question. I'm sorry, there are mics. I can't see anything. Are there mics? There are mics. If you wouldn't mind, just because that way everyone can hear, coming to one of the microphones. Just go, oh, here.
Okay, hello. In our job, we always establish good relationships with prominent scientists. And we make our own ideas, of course, about how trustful one or the other can be. And in this, we can be biased, of course. I'm referring to a case in Italy now. Don't you think that when a journalist writes a story accusing very prominent scientists of fraud or misconduct, it should, anyway, bring facts in the story itself? I mean, in the story that's just gone out now in Italy, very prominent scientists have been accused of fraud, but with no evidence in the story, just saying that their pictures were photoshopped. So I feel biased because I know these scientists and I can believe, I'm sure of their integrity.
Sorry, I think we're going to take the question now because...
Yes, sorry. My question is, how can we... Yeah, okay, it's clear, I think. How can we defend ourselves from our bias, and how strong should be evidence when you attack very prominent scientists?
Yes, so I think I know this story. This is indeed some extremely prominent scientists, and it was a police investigation that didn't go anywhere. And I think the frustration with the lack of attention in the universities, etc., led to a leak, leak of the police information, which allowed this story to be presented. And it's not an ideal way to do this without the evidence. But I thought that actually the story was not too bad. I read it. We were discussing it actually on Sunday evening. And it's as much as a newspaper can do. And I do agree that this is extremely damaging, and it's not the way that this story should come about through a journalistic piece in a newspaper. And I think the question is, why did it have to end up this way? Which of the organizations didn't do their job of, taking these... It isn't a trivial accusation. I mean, the data are there, and nobody did their job in controlling it, and this was the only way that it came out. So I think this is the beginning, not the end of the story.
Hi. I have a question about cases that are not quite clear-cut, so not falsification or retractions, but when you have slight data massaging or people who are not straightforward about their funding disclosure, for example, and you suspect some conflicts of interest, and it ends up being a kind of trial on the moral value or intention on the researcher, and I found it's kind of you find people who like him, people who don't, and it's hard to make solid reporting on that.
So the question is how to handle those cases?
Yeah.
I think, and I think this gets back to the previous question as well. I stick to facts as much as I can, and there actually are usually more facts than we think there are, and probably more facts than we learn. Conflict of interest disclosure. The journals don't tend to retract for that; they tend to correct for that. But if you look at when you do a massive story like Charlie Ornstein and Katie Thomas did in the New York Times about top researchers from Sloan Kettering and a cancer center in New York, a leading cancer center, you see this pattern. And I think that any single failure to disclose or what have you, I'm not sure that's a story at this point, but if you look at the amount that they were able to to find, the president, I think it's president, but whatever the sort of top person at Sloan Kettering resigned, and there were lots of other fallout from that. So I think those become real stories because they have real impact. See.
Hello, Laurent Simon from the Meta News. I just have one question about, we have talked of many examples in life sciences of misconduct and fraud. Do you have any examples in physics or mathematics or
Yes.
in other?
Go to the database. I mean, Alison probably has lots too. Go to the database. Every paper, every item has a subject. Is it as high? No. I mean, there aren't as many papers published, and there are other reasons for it, which I won't get into in the interest of time. But there are certainly cases, and some of them are actually quite prominent. I mean, the Schoen case, right, from 2003, which was Bell Labs and physics, probably at that time, I would argue, one of the best known and most scandalous at that time.
Yeah.
What's that? Well, the rates of retraction per field are about the same. So yes, I mean, I could tell you, I mean, if you did a search and we did this and obviously analysis, 80% or something are life sciences, but 80% of papers that are published are life sciences. So the rate is actually quite similar.
Okay, I want to know how important for you is the quality of the journal in the first place where the article was published, and specifically, do you look at predatory journals? And because we know that the quality of the study in the first place could be questionable, and so does that play a role? And do you think journalists have a role to play as well in maybe combating the spread of news via predatory journal articles?
Yes, so I think, does it matter whether the journal is high status or not? And I think that doesn't really play a role. The question to ask is the story impactful? And if something has appeared and it's incorrect in a low-impact journal, but it has a powerful impact on society or in some way, then it becomes a story. And I think there's more stories from the high-impact papers because the stakes are higher for science, but it's about the story, not the journal.
I would just say quickly that there is actually a pretty good, strong correlation between impact factor and retraction rate. Someone showed this 2011, and they've repeated that analysis. That probably is more of a screening effect. More people are reading these, but I do think it's something worth paying attention to. In terms of predatory journals, it's interesting. They just didn't used to retract at all. I mean, why would you? If you weren't ever doing peer review, why would you bother retracting anything? And then they started doing something, some of you may know the term virtue signaling, where they realized that people like us and others would write very positive things about them if they did the retraction the right way. So they started doing some of the best retractions I've seen. Now, of course, that's distracting. It doesn't change the fact that the original process was deeply flawed, to say the least. But I think we have to focus on the story and not necessarily get wrapped up in the brand of the journal. I think we have to take one more question, and then we'll have to close.
Yeah, I have a question. If you think that we have a role as science journalists in evaluating the level of fraud in a misconduct, I mean, if sometimes you have frauds like pictures manipulation that actually didn't impact really on the outcomes of the research. And this is a problem for me because when I report it, if it involves a therapy, it involves something that our readers are worried of, should we explain them in some way that we should disentangle the researcher misconduct and the validity of the results?
Yeah, so I'm not sure what the story could be here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say quickly because we actually, I want to be respectful of the next panel, but I guess I always question this something I see in retraction notices frequently, which is this had no effect on the results. Knowing exactly how difficult it is for journals, to get a single figure into a journal, the idea that a figure doesn't have anything substantial to do with the findings, or that it would have been published without that, I tend to be quite skeptical. So, I mean, yes, I think we should put everything in context and say why something maybe is a correction instead of a retraction, but I'm not sure that's as common as a lot of scientists would have us believe. Unfortunately, we're very much out of time, and so, again, thanks very much to Alison. Thank you all, and I'll be here and happy to answer questions.